James, you're the CEO.
Ooh.
I'm your Chief Sustainability Officer. Mr. CEO, I've got this brilliant idea.
But forgive my ignorance, I don't want to interrupt you, but isn't it one of those businesses that really requires economies of scale?
Have you noticed when he says, excuse my ignorance, you know he's going to stab you in the heart with a killer question?
Hello everyone and welcome back to the FSR Policy Briefcase with me, Emma Menegatti. No, sorry, it's James Kneebone again.
And me, Leonardo, still Leonardo. I apologize. If you prefer to have James and Emma, tell me and we will make the necessary replacements.
We are joined today also by Christopher Jones, part-time professor at the Florence School of Regulation, as well as former Deputy Director General of the European Commission's DG for Energy. Christopher has a deep legal and policy knowledge, which he these days applies most frequently to the worlds of hydrogen and carbon dioxide. He was already on the show last season talking about a potential regulatory framework for CO2 infrastructure, or rather a sort of regulation light, which he proposed as a necessary compromise to full-blown regulation, given the urgency of the challenge. I encourage listeners to go back to that episode. I had another listen myself in preparation for today, and I think Chris covered a lot of important points on the regulatory uncertainties that might be inhibiting investment. I can only conclude that you don't feel the urgency of the matter has been grasped, or perhaps simply that more direction is needed, because you very recently published a follow-up policy brief titled "The Role of CCS in the EU, Thoughts on a Possible Roadmap for the Next Commission." So no longer a framework, but a roadmap. And to my reading, this policy brief is primarily about making a case for why CCUS should be supported by the next College of Commissioners and how it can be done with minimal risk and public resources. If last time we were talking about regulatory frameworks, now we are speaking more conceptually about decarbonisation scenarios, as well as tricky issues like funding and standards. We will even revisit a good friend of the podcast, CCfDs. So in any case, thanks very much for being here, Christopher. And I really enjoyed reading your paper, as always. But for listeners who haven't yet read it, perhaps you could give us the 30-second pitch for CCUS as a priority for the next commission. You know, imagine you walk into an elevator with Ursula von der Leyen.
Okay, so you're the president of the commission.
I'll try.
Right, okay. And we'll do this by a
Congratulations.
series of questions rather than a boring monologue.
Oh, I'm getting nervous.
Okay. So, Madam President, do you agree that achieving net zero by 2050 is an obligation, not an option?
I think it's an obligation. I've just repeated that obligation in my political guidelines.
Second question. Do you agree that in order to get to net zero by 2050, we are going to have to be, I know you've proposed a 90% cut by 2040 compared to 1990 levels, but obviously there'll be discussion about this, but Council and Parliament. But do you agree that the lowest we could possibly go is 80%?
Oof. I don't know. Is that really true?
In 2040, in order to achieve 2050, you're proposing 90%. Would you accept less than 80% or even 75%? Let's say 75%.
I have no idea if my proposal included some margin for negotiation.
No, but you're going for 90%.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so even, the point is, even if we go for 80%, okay, so we go for 80%. So let's assume we go 80%. Let's be really pessimistic, Madam President, and assume that the Council and Parliament screws it up and says 80% by 2040. Okay, very good. Do you accept, therefore, that in order to achieve that, both the electricity system and ETS industry will need to be fully decarbonised or quasi-decarbonised by 2040 in order to reach 80%? Because we'll need the remaining 20% for agriculture, transport, building stuff. Yeah, so, okay, so far so good. We all agree that energy-intensive industry and electricity will need to be 100% or 99 or whatever percent decarbonised by 2040. Okay, great. Do you agree that, as you said, so obviously you should agree with this, that it's impossible to decarbonize energy-intensive industry. We can talk about the electricity system later, okay? Energy-intensive industry without carbon capture and storage, capture, usage and storage, by 2040. Do you agree that it's never going to happen without that?
If I read your paper well, I have the feeling that there are indeed some sectors where we probably need it and there is no other solution. What we don't know exactly is how big that is, right? That need, where we have no other option. And as you argue, we have a need where we probably have no other option. And then maybe to get some more economies of scale, we will also use it in other places where we do have other options. So, yeah.
Excellent. Do you agree, Madam President, the only thing the Commission has done so far is to put out some numbers about the amount that would need to be stored and captured? In the Net Zero Industry Act, you've obliged industry to invest in 50 million tonnes of storage. But that's a bit like building Disneyland and then not putting any roads to it, isn't it? Yeah, you built some storage, but there's no pipes to go to it, and there's nobody actually investing in capture. So do you agree, Madam President, that unless we solve this, oh no, let's do one more step in the thing, okay? So do you agree, Madam President, that you have now done the CBAM and the ETS, and by the way, congratulations for that, which means that by 2030, a lot of this energy-intensive industry that will need CCS, so steel, iron, cement, fertilizers, hydrogen, etc., okay, will be fully exposed to the effects of the ETS by 2034, I think it is, and they'll have to pay 50% of their allowances by 2030, right? So they will need CCS, surely, at the very, very latest by 2035, right? Because otherwise, they will have to decarbonize by 2035 because of the ETS, okay? And if they don't have access to CCS, how are they going to decarbonize? Okay, how are they going to do that?
Well, there are more expensive options, right? That's what you're worried about, that they either go for more expensive options or...
No. What they'll do is they'll buy allowances. And then we will have achieved the most stupid climate policy you can possibly imagine, which is we will have obliged our iron and steel and cement companies to buy allowances, ETS allowances, okay, without any decarbonisation that results. So the conclusion is, right, that unless you actually ensure that the CCS network is in place by the time they need it, at the latest 2035 for these companies, you've created a monster, Madam President. Okay? So, Madam President,
we're still in the elevator.
Yeah, we're still in the elevator. Sorry, I've hit the pause button. Okay, hit the pause button. Do you agree that you have no idea how much CCS you will actually need in 2030 and 2035? Because you haven't done the homework.
It's a big range, right?
You haven't done the homework. You've just given numbers. Do you agree you haven't done the numbers, Madam President?
It's a tough journalist, this one, isn't it?
Yeah.
Last one is.
That's not how an elevator pitch is supposed to go, but I'm going with it.
So do you agree we should actually do this? And get this, and find a way to get this infrastructure built in time for 2035 and work out actually how much of the stuff we actually need, rather than simply, as the Commission has done in the last Commission, probably wouldn't say this, which is just make up numbers and put a strategy and hope that things happen.
But there is some action foreseen, right? There is this decarbonisation, acceleration for industry, the whole idea. So there is some legislative files foreseen. So do you think this topic will be picked up in there?
I mean, the Commission has said very clearly that it's going to focus on CCS. Von der Leyen has said that she's going to make it one of her many priorities. Commissioner-elect Jorgensen has said the same thing. It's going to be a priority. I can't remember whether Ribeiro mentioned it as well, but it's clearly going to be one of the priorities of the Commission. The question is not whether it's a priority. The question is, and we can start talking about hydrogen as well, if you like, because it's the same problem as you mentioned when we were discussing earlier. Right? This Commission has to make a big change in the way it does between announcing targets and objectives and hoping that member states will achieve them, to actually making sure that we get the infrastructure that we need in place by 2035 when we will really need it to get to 2040. So unless the Commission actually does something different than what it's done in the past, we're not going to get there. I mean, let's think about hydrogen for a minute. When did we have the hydrogen strategy? Was it 28 or 2020?
2020.
2020. We're 4 years hence, there's a lot happening, but how many grids are being built?
The Germans have now committed to.
Germans have committed, the Dutch have got the money, the Belgians have got some money, that's it, as far as I'm aware. Okay? Demand doesn't exist. And almost all the projects that are in the pipeline are being delayed because there's no demand. So,
but the parallel James also makes is interesting, right? To what extent is there a parallel? Because we also started talking about hydrogen in the same way as we talk about CCS today. Like some applications we have no other option. And once we thought, okay, we have no other option, so we have to do it, then we start looking for additional applications. And before you knew it, we had the feeling it would become huge. Now it's downsizing a little bit. So might there be something similar for CCS? So, I mean, one thing is to say, okay, let's go for this big backbone system, but how big does it really need to be?
Okay, so let's, should we unpick hydrogen and then unpick CCS?
It's going to be a long elevator ride. The Berlaymont is a tall building.
We're out of the elevator. Okay.
We're already out of the elevator. We just realized after our elevator ride that we have an interesting conversation. Yeah. So I'm already picturing us sitting somewhere in a corner having a coffee.
In a terrible canteen, poorly catered.
Yeah. So, what happened with hydrogen? We had all the strategies, the huge numbers and whatever, okay? Then we had the legislative proposal for the infrastructure, which is brilliant. Now we've got a framework for the infrastructure, but nobody's building it, okay? And then we had the RED III directive, right? So the RED III directive requiring, 45% industrial hydrogen by 2030 and 60% by 2035?
It's 42%, but yeah, this ballpark, yeah.
I looked yesterday at the Platts. Have you ever seen the Platts Hydrogen Wall?
Yes.
Yeah. So they publish on a daily basis pretty much the cost of grey hydrogen, blue hydrogen, green hydrogen produced in the EU, Australia, and the Gulf.
I get a project level.
Okay, it's really interesting. So if you want to buy a kilo of grey hydrogen in the Gulf, $0.7. If you want to buy it in the EU, it's slightly more because the gas price is higher, but not hugely more. Okay, you want to buy blue, $3.4. Okay, so if you want to buy green in the EU, it's $7. Or between $3 and $4 in the Gulf. But of course, if you do it in the Gulf, you've got to turn it into ammonia, ship it to Europe, and then crack it back into hydrogen, which gets you back pretty close to $7 anyway. Yeah? So if you think about the numbers, okay, 60% of 8.4 million tons is 6 million tons. 6 million tons is 6 billion kilos, right?
8.4 million tons is current hydrogen demand in Europe. I assume that's the reference you make.
So 6 billion tons that the member states will need to be insured. If the numbers today remain the same, 6 billion tons at $6 a kilo requires subsidies of $36 billion a year.
Okay, but just I understand the point you make fundamentally, but it would also be fair to say at this point, under the Hydrogen Bank pilot auction, which was fundamentally a price discovery exercise, the winning bids cleared at 40 cents a kilo. So not €6 a subsidy, but 40 cents a kilo.
Correct.
And that shows you that they are receiving an enormous green premium for their product because, as you say, this Platts data suggests that the true cost of production is somewhere like 6. The fossil comparator is maybe 3. So the delta that has to be bridged is 3 or 4 euros. And the value of the subsidy is only 10% of that. So 90% must be being covered by a green premium in these most competitive bids. And they were sizable. Like there were bids below a euro that would have covered the EU's mandatory obligations for the key sectors for hydrogen.
We'll see where that goes, but how much of a green premium do you think exists outside very specific sectors like aviation fuel, which we pay for when we sign up for the aviation thing? Yeah. Sorry, we're getting sidetracked, aren't we? We always do this on these podcasts. We get totally sidetracked. But anyway, the point I wanted to make is you have the same approach in hydrogen at the EU level, which has been these high-level targets, without actually thinking through what you need to make it happen. Okay, so you've had the hydrogen bank. 3 billion euros in total.
2 billion in the end, but
yeah,
yes.
But the idea is 3 billion. But we just worked out we're going to need 36 billion in subsidies. So it's a fairly small amount compared to what we're going to need, right? So, but okay, some starts are there. Okay, let's talk about CCS finally. Sorry for sidetracking you, Madam President. Okay.
You've taken up for dinner at this point, so I think it's
let's talk about CCS, okay? So we've done our analysis, step by step, question by question, and we've reached the conclusion that we are going to need an awful lot of CCS, okay? Now you've changed roles, okay? Oh, now it's James. James, you're the CEO of a cement company, okay? I'm your Chief Sustainability Officer, okay? Mr. CEO, I've got this brilliant idea. So by 2035, I think the ETS price is going to be about 180 euros. Okay, which is fairly reasonable. Okay, and by 2035, we will be 100% exposed to the effects of the emissions trading system. Right. So in 2035, right. We will need to make sure the the CCS is there because we need CCS, okay? So I think we should contract long-term for storage today and fundamentally commit to it, and we should already go and talk to our infrastructure operator and ask them to make sure that that is on contract for the storage. Okay, so you as the CEO, you're going to throw that person out the window, okay? Because you're going to say, can you guarantee me that the ETS price will be 180 in 2035? No. Can you guarantee that the EU will not have abandoned the whole ETS because it got terribly difficult politically and has just melted down? No. Can you guarantee that it really will cost 180? No. Can you guarantee that the other cement plant down the road will not actually continue buying certificates and will just be blown out the market? No. It's a bit risky.
Yes.
It's a bit risky. We're not going to do that.
That's where this concept of carbon contract for difference comes into. So, I mean, one thing is to do the hydrogen bank type of approach with subsidies, right? Or we can have this carbon contract for difference. So you seem to think that that's one of the instruments to at least look at, right? To give some more certainty to industry.
Yeah. Well, let's take our hypothetical cement plant again, okay? Now, I'm going back to you as the CEO, okay? And I'm saying that, okay, I think it's going to be 180, and I think we should sign this. And the government has promised that if it's lower than 180, if it's 130, they'll make up the 30 euros difference. Okay?
Yeah, then it starts to make...
Then as a CEO, you say, right, get your pen out. Yeah.
But there, the challenge I've learned from some researchers, I mean, you're in your paper, you don't claim you already know exactly how this has to be implemented, right? You're just saying that this is one of the things we have to look at, but I've already learned that it's not so easy to design these kind of contracts because what is the guarantee you have to give in terms of carbon price depends on alternatives, right? So designing a contract like that is not so easy, but there is some experience at least. I believe.
There is.
Yeah.
And let's try and work it out between us, right, of how it might look rather than, I don't know. So how would I do that? Right, now we're somebody else, with the Dutch government or whatever, who've already done this in the S2E3. They already have carbon contracts for difference. So what we'd probably say is for high heat energy intensive industry. So, I mean, you have you have what I'd call the relatively easy to decarbonize industry, the low heat, which is pulp and paper, some chemicals, machinery, things like this, that need heat below 500 degrees. And there's a perfectly alternative, which is renewable energy, electric boiler, heat pump, and thermal storage. So, let's take that out of our conversation. That may or may not need CCS, probably not, I don't know, the market will sort that out on its own. But let's talk about the high heat energy intensive industry, steel, cement, glass, chemicals, petrochemicals, which is what we're talking about here, yeah? And we agreed that needs to be decarbonised by 2040, if we're going to get to our 2040 goals, right? So they're going to need a decarbonisation option. Do we know whether it's energy efficiency, hydrogen, electrification, CCS, a combination of all? I would say that they would be far better at working this out than we would around this table, personally. So wouldn't you simply say, okay, I need all that to be decarbonised, and their ability to invest today on those decarbonisation technologies, whatever you look at them are, okay, will be prejudiced because they don't know what the ETS price is going to be at 2035 when they need to do it, okay? So wouldn't we simply say, okay, I will set aside a certain amount of money to de-risk their decarbonisation. So I will say, okay, this year I'm going to put 3 billion, and I simply tender for the ETS strike price at which they are willing to invest to guarantee to be decarbonised by 2040. And then perhaps you as a cement company will say, okay, I've done all my sums and I've worked out I can do it by, James, you mentioned earlier, by substituting some of my cement with other products, by being more efficient. So I don't need to sequestrate all my process emissions. I can get rid of some of them another way, but the heat I'll have to perhaps I can use a bit of hydrogen. But I've found my portfolio and I think I can do it at 170 euros a tonne. So my strike price is 170 euros a tonne. And then you sign an agreement as the government saying, okay, we'll pay the difference between it. And then each company will find its own way. Would that work, is my question. I kind of think it probably would. And it would hit a certain technology neutrality.
Yeah.
Well, we know this kind of concept from renewable subsidies, right? So we have in the electricity market reform the idea that contract for difference, but then that's for the electricity price, right? Is the new way we will support renewables. What is nice is it works two ways. So it can act as a subsidy, but it can also act as clawing back money, right? So if they say...
Not in this case.
No.
Here's a question, because I've been trying to work this out, because I always thought that it would, right?
It's not, it doesn't have to be two-way, but it can be two-way. In electricity, it will be two-way.
In electricity, but with this, would it be two ways? Because let's assume your strike price is 160, and the government has promised to pay you the difference between whatever it is and 160. What if the price, the ETS price then goes to 180? Thing is, you've completely decarbonised 160, so you don't actually have to pay the 180. So you don't get any revenue to pay the government back. So there's no windfall profit in this case. So basically it's a one-way CFD, sadly enough.
For me, this kind of speaks a little bit to two problems. One is perhaps we get a little bit in these sectors that you've named towards the limits of where the ETS is an effective decarbonisation tool. By which I mean, there is now literature that suggests the ETS has been effective in doing decarbonisation, or what's typically referred to as the low-hanging fruit, the easy stuff, even adapting existing technologies and doing fuel switching and these kind of things that are relatively cost-effective already and often don't require a big change in your technological value chain. These are things that can be adopted fairly quickly and fairly easily, but it doesn't do all that good a job at providing these kind of technology revolutions, like completely changing the way that value chains are organized. Imagine going from existing steel facilities to an electric arc furnace. This is a completely different technology. It's not about bolting on some CCS to an existing plant or substituting a fuel source, buying renewable energy credits instead of taking fossil electricity, for example. This is a completely different technological value chain. And part of the problem, literature suggests, is that the signal you talk about is, as you say, not clear enough. You don't know for certain what price you will hit. And if you're a little bit risk averse, perhaps you will always err on the side of just paying for credits and iteration rather than revolution. And I thought your suggestions went a nice way to helping sort of give transparency and bridge a little bit of that sort of predictability failure, if we can call that, or limitation to the ETS. And I wondered if it then also spoke to this issue about technology neutrality, because we tend to refer to people or to technology neutrality quite euphemistically, quite positively, because it has the word neutral in it. So you're sort of inclined to think neutral good, Yeah. And I wanted to ask you, because you work on this hydrogen space, you work on the CO2 space, and technology neutrality is large in both of those kind of areas, whether you think there are moments when we need actually public sector to take a deliberate technology choice just for exactly that reason, to give clarity to the industry, to give predictability. We go in explicitly this direction and we will, support the amortization of existing assets. We will go a large way to supporting a specific technology, but we don't just say decarbonize in whatever way. There's a deliberate pathway chosen on the basis of, it having some spillover societal benefits. Imagine jobs in manufacturing sector, better for security, sovereignty, energy efficiency, air pollution. These kind of spillover benefits in society. So they say we make this specific technology choice. You give certainty to industry and you try and support that innovation, but you're ultimately sort of not letting the market decide, which is it's a bit of a taboo thing to say. I wondered what you thought about that based on your proposals.
It's really tricky. It was a great analysis, by the way. And in a way, your thing about the ETS reflects what I said about the hypothetical cement company, which is a bit of an illustration of what you said, isn't it? Because I know that I'm going to need CCS, but I'm not going to take the risk to pay for it up front, 10 years up front, and contract for it when I don't know what it is, what the price is going to be, and risks me left hanging, because you've got to be conservative in a thing of this size, which means that your infrastructure will not be built in time. So this is the real chicken and egg that results from the ETS, and it's both technological and it's both infrastructure and investment. Because, by the very nature of the ETS, it's very tricky, in our hypothetical again, for a cement company to put up the 100 million or however much it is for the capture unit, pay for the transmission of the CO2 in time, and contract for the storage.
Yeah.
Because you just don't know. And so that in a way is the failing of the ETS. And you're right, it was good at the beginning, but now we're getting to the real crunch time.
Yeah, capex intensive investments, these new technology cycles.
Highly risky,
exactly,
etc. The end game decarbonisation. And so you're right, the question is, how do you bridge that gap? Okay? And I think there's two different sides to the coin here. Okay? One is industry. So again, with my hypothetical cement, I'm offering you you're the CEO again, I'm offering you the chance of this CFD, okay? And you have to bid in a strike price of an ETS price at which you're guaranteed to decarbonise, and you explain how you're going to decarbonise, okay? So you'd be competing. So there'd be the cement company, that would be competing against a steel company, and then you would have a merit order, And obviously the ones with the cheaper strike price would get the money first. But they would choose the technology. Okay? Now that starts giving you some transparency downstream and some financing, because obviously if they take the strike price, if they take the CFD, and there are appropriate penalties for not implementing what you've promised to do, they would then contract for CO2 or hydrogen or electrification or whatever in order to decarbonize. So that would be, this is really tricky, isn't it?
But forgive my ignorance, I don't want to interrupt you, but isn't it one of those businesses that really requires economies of scale? If you have different companies bidding different technologies, bidding different futures, just saying, well, this works for us, this works a bit better for us, it just doesn't work, right? I mean, this is a huge CapEx intensive industry. You need trunk pipelines, massive storage sites. You need to be able to scale capture and do it efficiently and repeatably, because also we frequently talk about 90% capture rates. We could go into that. I don't know. That was also one of the questions I wanted to ask you. Has it been done? Yeah. Because people talk about it, but I've not seen it done. So there are all these things that are like, it's difficult on an individual company level basis to say, yes, okay, I will invest in CO2 infrastructure at this ETS strike price, because what if my neighbor CEO of the glass industry in Antwerp chooses not to? Then what? I'm going to pay the whole thing myself? Of course not. So
Leo, have you noticed when he ever says, excuse my ignorance, you know he's going to stab you in the heart with a killer question?
I'm going to help you.
Okay, good. Yeah. Okay, good.
So you also say in the paper that it's not only about CCfDs to create demand. You also say we need to build that network, right? If somebody wants this to become a real option, somebody has to stick their neck out and build some sort of infrastructure with state guarantees and anticipatory investments, because otherwise, indeed, you just have a bit of demand, but that demand is not enough to get the infrastructure you need to bring it to the storage site. So you will have some storage sites. Some people have been obliged to develop them. You will have some demand thanks to CCfDs, but then the whole thing in the middle, as you rightly say, won't necessarily develop, right? Yes, but your roadmap is having several elements.
Yeah, I mean, James has, in a way, identified the problem, which is in a unicorn world, next year, the EU would tender for CFDs for all its energy-intensive industry.
Altogether.
Okay.
By the way, CCfD, not to confuse with the CFD from electricity.
CCfD, okay. Unicorn world, okay. We would put 100 billion on the EU's balance sheet or whatever it is, and then they would all tender for their chosen technology. We would have our data, and the investments would have clarity, and off we go. Yeah? And that would solve your problem, basically.
Yeah, if at the end of it you had a critical mass of CCUS in favour, then it could work, right?
And the companies could change their mind as they go on, but at least you'd have a market for end technology in 2035. Okay? We all know we've got more chance of actually seeing a unicorn than that unicorn solution happening, right? So what you will get is, I think, CCfDs coming bit by bit by bit by bit by bit over the next 10 years, which gives us an imperfect and moving technological industrial solution to this. So then we get to your industrial policy question. Should you therefore say, okay, well, I have to accept that even doing a progressive CCfD policy in order to de-risk our industry, enable it to compete globally and prevent delocalization, we will still not have enough critical mass sufficiently early to de-risk and enable the, I'll say TSOs, or what do we go, CO2Os, or whatever, the infrastructure providers, whoever they may well be, and we're not going to get into that today, are we? Whoever they may well be, to invest, okay? So we're going to have to make some choices, because I think we can accept it as a given that unless the CO2 infrastructure is in place in 2035 to enable these companies that are fully exposed to the ETS by that date, they are screwed, or our climate policy is screwed, whichever way you want to look at it. So therefore, we have to bridge that gap somehow, okay? Now, the next question you're going to ask is, how do you know how much infrastructure you need?
Yes, also a good question, but what I was going to say before that, I was going to ask, just playing devil's advocate, could you not just call whatever that is, those ones that are left behind in the transition, collateral damage? Because the inverse scenario, the counterfactual is, okay, yes, you don't have the CO2 infrastructure, these industries have to leave, or they have to be under these kind of, I agree with you, sort of market failure conditions where they're paying for credits but have no viable decarbonisation option. They could be protected by a CBAM, but nevertheless, it's a market failure, policy failure, I agree with you.
Okay,
but let's just stay with it.
We're not going there.
You could call it, arguably, collateral damage, because that collateral damage will cost you less than this potentially, enormous capex cost infrastructure for what might potentially be not that large a critical mass. So previous to the podcast recording, we were chatting in the office, and I just mentioned, we always hear this same sector referenced in the CCUS debate, this cement sector, and you put the numbers in the paper that this is a good example of a first no regret CCUS application where you really have no choice. These are emissions of CO2 produced by a chemical process, so not something that can be substituted with hydrogen or electrification or something. Now, you say that it's 114 million tons of emissions in the EU, this sector. This equates to about 2.5% of the EU's total, or about 10% of ETS sector emissions. Without CCUS, you can reduce emissions from cement by roughly 40% without getting into crazy things like expensive substitutes from other kind of, marginal innovations. These are, energy-related emissions and such. Mixing different substitutes, so those more marginal changes, a bit more niche, can get you to 50 or 70% reduction. And yes, it's a bit complex. It requires a little bit of innovation at the margins, but you've got to half or maybe even 3/4 of your emissions taken out of that. And I wonder at that point, the critical mass, if we don't have a long list of other sectors below cement, starts to look even thinner, doesn't it? Because of course, even if that cement is really expensive, but at least it's clean, you didn't have to build all this infrastructure. Because part of my feeling is, it's also why I raised the technology neutrality point, is for the time, like political energy, as well as resources that we put into discussing the CO2 issue, you are taking oxygen and you're taking resources from other technological solutions, of course. It's a zero-sum game. There's only so much money, there's only so much political time, there's only so much bureaucratic capacity, whatever you want to discuss it. So my point is also, unless we have a really bankable critical mass, I wonder if it's not just better, first accept some collateral damage, and second, do some expensive niche decarbonisation solutions and insulate those industries best we can. Because, of course, the counterfactual is CCUS network not for free either. This is a really expensive investment decision.
So you should have started that with, excuse my ignorance, before starting. Okay, so here we go. But this is one of the things I mentioned in my paper, that we are desperately lacking data on this, desperately lacking. Because if we were sort of having a normal academic, I know better than you type argument, I would have retorted to think, so do you know, young man, whether the cost of all your fancy cement innovations is cheaper than 160 euros a tonne of carbon?
Some of those marginal applications, so I first mentioned this 40% figure, these are not these kind of like fancy substitutes that are sort of low TRL. These are like basic process emissions changes that we can do, not related to the chemical reaction. And these would be closer to the kind of low-hanging fruit decarbonisation that you already mentioned has been discussed, as is achievable with existing.
Oh, sorry, we're getting into exactly what I was saying. But the point is, you've got 2, potentially 3 different areas where you need CCS. And the basic point I make in the paper is I have no idea which of those are competitive compared to hydrogen or electrification or process changes or technological development, because the Commission and everybody else has gone down this route without the data. I don't know the data. I've looked for the data. All I find is academics repeating each other that the cost of CCS is about 150 to 180. Yeah, and we been repeating each other on this because the IEA said it and then somebody else said it. But I get the impression everybody's saying, but when I talk to people in the industry, they confirm those numbers, they're about right. And even though Portos and Longship and whatever, they're saying these numbers are sort of ballpark, but we're ballpark. But we don't know even whether that's right, okay? We don't know, and first of all, we had for steel, we had the grand prize, we'll do it by hydrogen electrification, and ThyssenKrupp got $1.5 billion from the German government. Now they're saying, can't do it. Can't do it with green hydrogen, way too expensive. So they'll probably have to do it with CCS, but none of us have any clue, honestly speaking. So where do we land, therefore? We land knowing a lot of these industries, okay, for process emissions, okay, for fossil fuel burning for high heat energy intensive industry, for electricity production, question mark, which we can have a little dabble at in a minute if you like, and then for negative emissions, we will need tons of CCUS, whatever tons may be. Other tons, million tons, hundreds of million tons, I just do not know. But what I do know is without it, we will have by 2035 the dumbest climate policy you can ever think of, okay? So the point is, I said in that, okay, we need to do perhaps 3 things. One is these carbon contracts for difference to start getting discovery.
Yeah.
Start the process for actually giving our industry a chance to survive after 2035, because the C-band doesn't work very well, to be perfectly frank, okay? We are going to, in my opinion, try and build the elements of a no-regrets grid and take a punt on industrial policy. And then the whole debate is, okay, what is a no-regrets grid? And yeah, you're absolutely right. We have to make sure we don't overbuild it. We have to make sure we don't underbuild it as well.
Because otherwise nobody will actually consider that option when bidding for the CCfD.
Exactly. Yeah.
So that's the tricky part, right?
And to be fair, when I raised the point about technology neutrality, it was not to say that technology neutrality should preclude, if we make a technology choice as policymakers, that CO2 networks should be precluded from that. Quite the opposite. You could make the case, I think, fairly with CCUS. Okay, there's a lot of options out there, there's a lot of indecision, but we have a technological pathway that could be compatible for lots of industries. But to take away this indecision, we will make we will be an agenda-setting, leading public sector, and we will make a technology preference for CCUS, and therefore compel these industries to use it, and it will get the economies of scale required in order to make it solve not only the no-choice CCUS, but also the more marginal applications. You could look at technology picking in a favourable way, of course, to CCUS as well. That would be the opposite point.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think where I'm coming to, and this discussion is really helpful as well, because it's also a moving target, is because the CCfDs will be gradual and won't give us discovery, we are going to have to make a decision to build a certain grid. So over the next couple of years, we should actually spend an awful lot of time trying to get robust numbers of where will it really be needed, and then build a grid.
Well, could you not go a step back? I mean, I don't feel like we really debunked my point on the cement. I wonder if you need the numbers first to go, to get the numbers first about how many industries are there? Is it just cement, or what are the other absolute no other option emissions we have? And if we eliminate 50% of those with low-hanging fruit decarbonisation options, what's then left on the table? So that bit of data first, and then you go, okay, there's a CO2 grid required, yes or no. And then from there,
that's exactly what I'm saying,
yeah.
Which is you need the data from cement, from steel, from glass, from what else we got? Petrochemicals, chemicals, the high heat energy intensive industry. And I'll throw a curveball as well, okay? What are we going to use for grid balancing in 2040?
You see many studies where the option of having gas power plants with CCS is still considered.
Okay.
In many studies.
So and I don't know what the answer is, okay? So obviously batteries, fine.
Yeah, but not only.
And then for the 15%, 20%, which is not renewables, peak and trough, okay? To store the peak and use the trough. So batteries for a bit, yeah, fine, but that's not a solution. So what do we got left? Hydrogen ready. Brand new hydrogen ready turbines, okay?
Which some say will be more expensive than the
yeah. Okay, but
CCS.
okay, but so hydrogen ready turbine. Nice thing about it is you don't need to attach it to CCS. Okay, so you avoid that. So you can have a hydrogen ready turbine. You only run it 1,000 hours a year, right? And you're using hydrogen. Okay, so you don't need to build the whole CCS. Is that going to be cheaper than sticking a CCS, a capture and storage on an existing OCGT, CCGT, but only use it 1,000 hours a year? Okay, and if the answer to the first, it's cheaper to build the hydrogen ready than the CO2 capture, you've then got, are you going to use green or blue? But then if green is $7 a kilo and blue is 3.5, I'd want to use blue, right? But the thing is, then I need CCS to produce my blue hydrogen next to my electricity plant anyway. Okay, so whether you're going to need CCS for electricity balancing, I don't know. But we're back to can we have some data on this, please?
Oh, for me, the point comes back again to this technology pathways question. Because then you go, if you make a clear technology pathway choice, to give the opposite scenario, for electrification and electrolytic gases, so in this case green hydrogen, then you don't have this anxiety about will it be blue hydrogen and therefore I'll need CCUS anyway, because you know you're going to overbuild your renewables capacity to decarbonize your grid, and then you will be using that surplus renewables for producing hydrogen as well as your imports or whatever, but you've made a clear technology preference. So in that sense, okay, we're 1 foot in, 1 foot out. You give that kind of direction, which although maybe has some winners and losers, you at least can then create a cohesive framework, because of course the more you are integrating renewables into the electricity system, the more of this kind of balancing effect the hydrogen can do, and the more sense it makes to do seasonal storage with electrolytic renewable hydrogen. And of course, just from a structural cost perspective, blue hydrogen will never be an attractive proposition for Europe on just like an economically structural level, because we will always be importing that natural gas, from another country. It won't be a domestically produced product. So in that sense, the co-value that it gives to other industries, I mean, you talk about technology, value chains, manufacturing, all these kind of things. It's not a compelling proposition, and perhaps that's why you see renewable hydrogen preferenced not just in terms of production credits, but also in terms of the incentives in the innovation space, for developing electrolyzers. And even in the second European Hydrogen Bank auction round, they did this, what was perhaps unthinkable a few years ago, and put local content requirements on the projects. So they're not allowed to source more than 25% of their electrolyzers from China. This is goes against WTO rules. It would have been almost unthinkable a few years ago. But it goes against the spirit, at least, let's say. It's discrimination based. I mean, it's one country they pick, almost seemingly, it's not 25% of non-EU. It's really specific about China in that sense. At least, let's say,
but
it points towards
supporting
supporting domestic manufacturing.
Yeah. If the WTO was functioning, you'd have to make a case. So, Madam President, have we got to the following conclusion from this long and winding elevator discussion? Okay. So, number one, we agree that without CCS at scale by 2035, we're not going to meet our targets. Okay? We agree that it's going to be significant, but honestly speaking, we have no idea how much we're really going to need. We can already start doing some back of the envelope numbers, but circular, without it, if we don't succeed in getting it there by 2035, we're screwed. Okay? The current ETS on its own will not deliver what we want because of the chicken and egg, valley of death, etc., etc. Okay? So, therefore, the Commission is going to have to be brave in order to deliver what they've been setting targets at, rather than simply setting new targets and hoping that. So, in other words, sticking your head in the sand and hoping everything is going to be all right is not going to do it. It would be a dereliction of the Commission's duty. So, therefore, you've got to make some really tricky choices. You first of all are going to have to set up a, should we call it a carbon bank, a CO2 bank or whatever, CCfD bank, in order to lead the way with the member states. You are going to have to get off the fence and find somebody who is willing to define what is a no regrets grid. With all the errors and problems and difficulties and fact that once you've done it 10 years later, you're going to get criticized for either overinvesting or underinvesting. But you've got to do it. And then you've got to ensure that industry builds that grid in time, which means you're going to have to do some other de-risking, like the Germans have done with hydrogen, for the anticipatory investments that the grid will have to do. So you're going to have to do two things. You're going to have to do these CCfDs, and you're going to have to de-risk the infrastructure through anticipatory investment guarantees, or this is not going to happen. And I know this is extremely uncomfortable and requires you to do James-esque type of industrial cherry picking, but if you do the no regrets examination to the best of your ability, and you do CCfDs that give transparency, the chances that we will screw up in our no regrets grid is at least reduced. Is that where we've come, Madam President?
It's a nice way to close, but just for the readers that want to also read the paper, I'll give them a few more reasons, because I think we went to the core of the paper, but there is also quite some other elements in your roadmap. Just to mention a few, there is this importance of involving UK and Norway. There is also this idea of having to establish a CO2 purity and other relevant standards issue. There is an issue on clarifying treatment of state guarantees, because one thing is to have state guarantees, the other thing is to know what is allowed, what is not allowed. There is this topic of certification and balancing how to account for a system with CO2. You also refer to a London protocol on cross-border transport for CO2. So there seems to still be a lot of work to be done beyond these, because we focused a lot on that no-regret grid and on this CCfD, but there is more in your roadmap, right?
There's tons. There's tons.
So they'll have to read it.
We've just looked at the ostrich in the room, yeah, which has presently got its head in the sand. Okay, we haven't looked at all the periphery. But the periphery is easy. If you just do the periphery, so typical commission is you do the periphery and you set a target. But both with hydrogen and CCUS, that ain't going to work anymore. And if the next commission doesn't get its head out of its sand and deal with the elephant in the room, in 2035 we're all going to be wondering where our industry is.
Yeah, the conversation goes much further. I think we could talk all day about it. I also wonder, the more we talk about it, that you commit to the CO2 and you commit to the hydrogen, and how much do they cannibalize each other, and you risk that you just fail at both.
You're back to data, and no regrets.
Agreed.
Try and screw up as little as you can.
And I think that was for me, the point you finished on when you did your summary narrative on the importance of data and establishing this, these industries with absolutely no alternative, and what that grid in its, most core form would look like, would be a fascinating place to start. And I really liked the suggestion of the CCfDs and this competitive element in order to do genuine price discovery. Because I agree with you, I feel like it's something, if you commissioned another study, if you asked for more analysis, I don't know if you'd get closer, would you? Because it seems like it's really something that needs these specific bids. And if there's one thing we learned from the hydrogen bank, is that it cut through a lot of the noise about, this is the subsidy we needed. I mean, it was crazy. Like in the UK, they give something like €8 a kilo subsidy. I think in Denmark, an auction cleared at 6. In the US, of course, it's $3. In Europe, we're subsidizing at 40 cents a kilo. Like that's, for me, in lots of ways, is a huge victory. And if you could achieve a similar, difference in expectations from what we expect to have to subsidize the CO2 at 150, 180 to make it competitive, and in reality, there were projects that could be so much lower than that, that would be really exciting. Huh?
May end up at 230, and at least we'd know.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that would be brilliant. But
so we're all aligned.
We're all aligned. Brilliant.
Let's go and have a real dinner, not this fake dinner that you promised me after the elevator.
No, but thank you very much. It was really...
That was lots of fun,
It was
as
a pleasure.
always. Cheers, guys. Oh, one last thing. One last thing? I was telling them earlier, I've actually solved the chicken and egg problem. Or at least I will do earlier. Because as academics, we are all asking ourselves the famous chicken and egg problem. Okay, and I think I might have solved it. I'm gonna tell Leo next week, because I've ordered a chicken and egg on Amazon, and I'll let you know.
Very good. Thank you very much for listening this week. We really appreciate it, and there'll be another episode, same time next month. Thanks very much.
Check.